There was a study in 2020 that looked at the state of the evidence for digital agriculture. And in that study, they identified 315 studies that met their inclusion criteria. And that was looking back over a 20-year period. A scan of the literature earlier this year, just a quick scan with the similar inclusion criteria, found an additional 130 studies that were published since 2020. So that's just in the last 4 years. And so this is really fantastic growth. And I have to say thank you to all of you who have been participating in the research and actually allowing the results to be published so that we can all learn together. Of those 130, about a third were experimental or quasi-experimental, so meaning they allow us to actually get into that causal chain to understand that mechanism. And of the 130, you can see on here, very few are still looking at inclusivity, risk, resilience, and climate, and cost benefit, or even adoption of the digital solution. We looked at adoption of the solution itself as well as adoption of the practices that maybe the solution was recommending. So while we have seen this explosion of growth, we actually still have a pretty thin evidence base. And we know that there are a lot of different solutions out there, which makes it really hard to generalize findings because there's different delivery models, different types of solutions, and we're seeing a very high level of heterogeneity in the results. So for example, I'm just gonna highlight two. There was an RCT, so a randomized control trial in Nigeria, that wanted to understand the yield and income effects of delivering personalized advice on fertilizer to rice farmers. That study found that the households that were given this personalized advice compared to blanket advice, they increased their yield by 7% and their profits by 10%. And that was increasing yields without increasing the total quantity of fertilizer that they used. And that advice was being delivered by an agent who was digitized with the Rice Advice app. On the other hand, a recent study on video-mediated extension in Ethiopia found that the videos themselves helped to increase the uptake of the recommended technologies and practices around seeding rates and row spacing, but there was no impact on yields. That adoption of the technologies through the digital solution didn't actually impact yields. So that's what I mean. We're seeing, if you dig into all of these, there's just a lot of variation in the results. And the last point here is we all know that adoption and use of these solutions is a precursor to impact. But adoption doesn't always equal impact. And in Africa, we're seeing that the adoption rates of digital ag solutions remains very low. So a recent study, the State of the Sector report that it launched today and we'll hear about tomorrow, estimates that only 5% of farmers are actually using digital ag solutions. And in mature markets like Kenya and Nigeria, that number is slightly higher, but overall, we're still seeing very low adoption rates. And this is really important to all of us, whether you're an innovator or an investor, policymaker, researcher. A key question is how can we increase adoption and use? How do we create incentives for farmers to continue using these solutions? So different types of research methods can be used at different points in time to help us inform these decisions. So really we have a variety of tools in our toolbox to help answer these questions. While there are many different barriers to adoption, some things are fairly well understood, like trust, literacy. We know cost is a barrier. But how does a product or service actually overcome those barriers? That's where behavior change research or methods within the human-centered design approach come in, with qualitative methods or things like A/B testing that can be used to help quickly inform product design or to help unpack the contextual factors that may be limiting uptake. And once adoption is established and you have farmers that are actually using your solution, the next question is like, what is the value? Can we quantify that value? Can we confirm? We heard in the advisory session from DigiCow, right? They had an idea of the value and then they used the study to help validate the impact that was generated. So that's where agile or leaner measurement approaches can be really well suited to generating this type of evidence. These methods are generally more rapid, lower cost than traditional impact assessments, and can generate early insights into the benefits that farmers are getting. And in a world with limited resources, impact investors and decision makers and government and other organizations need data to inform decisions about where to invest their funds for the greatest social or environmental return. And that's understanding how well a program or initiative works, and the cost effectiveness helps to inform those decisions. And that's where randomized evaluations are really well suited to understand that causal impact, to quantify that impact, and to answer questions around cost effectiveness. So this afternoon in our breakout sessions, you're going to have an opportunity to learn about these different approaches from our partners and how these tools can be used, the types of evidence they generate, and how that can really help you with your decision making wherever you are along that journey. So we'll have one session that's being led by Busara, where you can learn about the human-centered design approaches, another led by 60 Decibels on leaner impact assessments, and then one led by the Center for Effective Global Action, CIGA, on impact evaluations. And our goal for everybody today is for you to come away from these sessions with a better understanding of what tools are available to you, how you can access funds and resources to engage in this type of research, and the value that it can bring to your organization.
Is going to be the lean evals. So we're going to be talking you through what these methods are. I know the names sound a bit daunting. I promise you we'll simplify them for you. And the last of it is we're going to tell you how you could choose between the two for your agriculture enterprise. Before we get into this, I just want to see who we're presenting to. So how many of you have worked with 6 Decibels before or heard of us? Oh, wow, Hanadi, I don't think you count. If you hadn't heard of us, that would be concerning. But it's good. It's good to know that there are some friends in the room. For those of you who aren't acquainted with us, let's get acquainted. 60 Decibels is a tech-enabled impact measurement company that simplifies gathering data. So I know there's a lot of words, but what it means is we simplify it for you to listen to who matters the most to your business. So for agriculture, that can be people like your farmers, agriculture agents, agripreneurs, SME owners, and a whole other host of stakeholders that you may be working with. We do this via phone-based surveys that happen in local languages in any of the countries that you operate in. And for this purpose, we're going to be talking about this grant that we had with Busara and Gates, where we tested out some new methodologies of doing causal inference. So let's chat about the 3 objectives of the grant. Today, I'm going to be focusing on the third one, which is measuring the impact of digital services on smallholder farmers' income, productivity, and resilience. Just quickly on what we're doing. So the 60 Decibels way of doing things is lean. What this means is we keep things short, conversational phone surveys, and we do it with a small number of stakeholders. So it's very easy for you to collect the data. What we have retained in the way of doing impact evaluations, which you may be familiar with, are fairly elaborate. We've kept them lean. So that means that they're cost effective, they're time saving, and we want to keep them as simple for you to do as possible so they can be sustainable over a longer period of time. Let's start with actually the first one, which has quite a cute name. It's called the Qualitative Impact Protocol, or the QIP. And I'm going to hand it over to Hanadi, who's going to quip in on this and present us through the rest.
Thanks, Ayushi. Amazing. Okay, so like Ayushi said, I'm going to be talking about 2 methodologies, the Lean QIP and the Lean Evaluation. For both, I'm going to start by talking you through the theory of how these evaluations are done, and then I'm going to present you with a case study of what we piloted over the last year, and also kind of discuss how doing this type of evaluation can help your organization. So let's start with the QIP. Amazing. Okay. So at a very high level, the QUIP is a qualitative evaluation approach developed by the University of Bath in the UK. This approach gathers evidence through what we call narrative causal statements. And I'll show you an example of exactly what this is in a minute, but just to kind of give you kind of a sense of what that means, we ask farmers about a specific outcome, like change in production, in the last X period of time, so let's say 12 months, and we let the farmer tell us what caused that change over that period. So broadly, a QUIP has 4 key features. The first is that it does not require a baseline or a comparison group to establish causality, which makes it very easy to conduct. The reason that you don't need this is because the farmer becomes the comparison group or the counterfactual for themselves. How, you may ask? It's because we use open-ended and exploratory interviews that are structured around outcomes. So we ask farmers if they saw a change in an outcome in a defined period of time, and then we let the farmer connect the dots between an intervention and that outcome. So it's very kind of conversational. A lot of the time, there might be concern about biasing a response if you're letting farmers draw their own conclusions. So in order to combat that, we use blindfolding. So that means both the researcher and the respondent is not aware of the actual intervention being asked about. Sometimes you can unblind the enumerator, but at a minimum, the farmer should never know about the intervention that's being interviewed about. And then the final thing is QUIPs can rely on small sample sizes, again, making them very easy to administer. So usually the minimum threshold that's defined by the University of Bath, who established this, is a sample size of 24, which I don't know, I'm sure there's a lot of statisticians in the room that are like 24 is way too small, but I'll explain why. There is flexibility around like if you can increase or that sample size, so that's what we've done with 60 decibels, but the kind of minimum threshold is 24. Okay, let's talk about what we did. So the way that 60 decibels established a kind of leaner approach to the QUIP is that we cut down the interview time by a third, so the interviews took about 20 to 25 minutes as opposed to over an hour. We used more targeted questions, and we conducted these interviews over the phone instead of in person. So from these experiments, we learned that leaner QUIPs are most useful when you're showing that your theory of change is correct, which is kind of standard for a QUIP, and that's why it can rely on a smaller sample size, because the goal is not to quantify your impact. The goal is to tell you how your impact has happened. I'll show you what this means in a minute. The second is that if you're using the leaner approach, it's better for measuring short causal pathways. And what we mean by this is that when you're conducting a kind of quick interview over the phone, it's easier to do this when the distance between the intervention and the outcome is short. So it's less kind of mental gymnastics that a farmer would have to do to draw a conclusion to a particular outcome. So the example I'm going to use is credit. That's kind of open source. You can get it for anything. So you take out credit. You use that credit to purchase seeds. You do all of these other things throughout the season, and at the end of the season, you have higher production. It's difficult for the farmer to reflect on, oh, I took out credit and I purchased seeds, and that's why, which makes it a little bit more complicated when you're doing the leaner QUIP. The third thing is that it's best when the kind of behavior change is specific and it's tied to an outcome. So I don't know if DigiCow is here. I don't know if Panita is here. No. Anyway, I'm going to talk about DigiCow in a minute, but I'm sure if you were in the kind of advisory session this morning, you heard about them. But DigiCow is a company that gives training to farmers, and a part of that training is improving their feed, which very directly links to productivity of their cattle. So that is a good example of a kind of direct, to-the-point behavior change that is easy to do with a QUIP. Again, the credit example, I'm not discounting credit. You can definitely do it with credit, but I'm just going to use it as an example here, is that when you take out a loan, again, that's like open for anything that you want. The outcomes can be endless if you are purchasing it to get seeds, a solar pump, et cetera, et cetera. So it makes it a little bit harder when you're trying to draw that conclusion in a short phone interview. And the last thing is that it's best when it's kind of implemented at the end of an agricultural season. So QUIPs only require one round of data collection, which again makes them easier to implement. And it's best to do that when all of the kind of impact from the season has already been realized. So it's best at the end of an agricultural season. It's easier for a farmer to reflect on a certain period if you anchor it in a holiday or a specific occasion. So for this case, we talked about the Easter holiday. And then on top of the behavior changes, we also looked at specific outcomes, so if the farmer perceived any changes to their production or their earnings. I put the questions up here so that you can see what we mean by kind of exploratory, open-ended interviews, but there were also a series of prompting questions that we armed our enumerators with that would help them steer the conversation. But this was kind of the main question that we asked. I think the slides will be sent out if anyone's curious in the future about reading these, so I'll skip ahead. Okay, so the questions that we asked resulted in responses like this. So what you see in red is exactly what we did with the data. We coded every response to see what key themes emerged, so it made it easier for us to analyze. So this is an example of what we mean by a narrative causal statement. So the enumerator asked about a change in earnings in the last 5 months, and this is how the farmer responded. Again, this farmer did not know that we were asking them about DigiCow, and neither did the enumerator. So this was completely the story that they told on their own. If everyone's had a chance to read it, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm not going to read it out. So this is actually the most common causal pathway that we saw with the farmers that worked with DigiCow that led to a change in earnings. So it just shows you kind of the story that they identified for themselves and how each step builds on each other. And it's really interesting to see that this theme was common across on the majority or a high proportion of the farmers that we spoke to. They told you the exact same pathway without any kind of prompting. So this kind of illustrated that DigiCow's theory of change, which is what we set out to prove, is accurate. So I'm just going to quickly actually walk you through it. So the first thing is that the farmer receives a DigiCow advisory. They say that from the advisory, they introduce mineral salts or dairy meals and supplements to the cattle's diet. This improved the health and nutrition of their cattle, which then led to better milk quality and production, which overall increased their earnings. This is a narrative that farmers set on their own. Okay, we also understand that sometimes it's easier to consume information in numbers. So this is another way to visualize the data, although it's not typically standard for a QUIP. But there is an important distinction here that I wanted to point out for you, is that there's a difference between direct and indirect attribution. So when we were first kind of introducing this methodology to the sector, a lot of companies told us, well, farmers don't know the name of our company, so how are you going to do this? And so the way that we did it is that there's a distinction between direct attribution, which is where a farmer said that a particular outcome happened because of DigiCow, or another name that farmers know for DigiCow. And indirect attribution is where the farmer implemented the specific advice, so we know exactly what training each farmer got offered to them in that period of time. And they didn't mention DigiCow by name, but the assumption is that because they received that training, they implemented that practice that led to that specific outcome. I know this is a little bit more convoluted, so if you have questions about this in the end, please ask me. I just wanted to show you the difference between the two. So to wrap this up, we wanted to illustrate the benefit of conducting a lean QUIP for organizations. So we've talked about how it provides validation of a theory of change, it demonstrates causal attribution, and it introduces farmer voice. But to add to that, we actually spoke to DigiCow, and again, if you were in the session this morning, you would have heard this from them as well. But we wanted to understand, over the past year, how have they actually used these insights? And so what DigiCow told us was that the insights have been really helpful internally for their team to kind of boost confidence and morale, because they know that what they've set out to do, they've achieved. They've also used it in a lot of marketing materials, so they've been able to onboard more farmers to their services, which has helped, in turn, increase their revenue. And then they've also used it to secure more grant funding so they can expand the actual services that they're offering to farmers, all of which is amazing and wonderful. So that is all I have for the QUIP. I'm going to leave questions for the end, but I'm just going to jump into another methodology. This one is a little bit more complex, so I'm going to really try to simplify it. So if you have any questions at the end, please let me know. So the lean evaluation. So we're not actually done piloting all the different methods under the lean evaluation, so hopefully next year I will see you all again and we'll be able to introduce some of these insights. But for now, I just wanted to introduce what we've been doing. So for the lean evaluation, we set out to find a quasi-experimental approach for measuring causal impact, which still tried to maintain speed and ease of implementation. So our main approach that we wanted to test was a difference in difference. How many people in the audience know what a diff and diff is? Cool. Okay, there's a few. There's actually less than I thought, so that's fine. Okay, so a diff and diff. So the key features. You can ignore the graph if that's helpful for you or not, but that's kind of an illustration of what it looks like. So the diff and diff, in a difference and difference analysis or a diff and diff, there's a baseline and there's a control group. And you're comparing these two groups across 2 points in time. So the pre-intervention and the post-intervention. So there's two differences. There's a difference between time and there's a difference between groups, which is why it's called a diff and diff. So this is, again, like a bit of a complex methodology, which I'm not going to get into the lecture of it, but if you have any questions about how it's done, I'm happy to answer them. So diff and diffs typically take a lot of time to implement, and they are quite expensive. So to do this in an efficient and lean way, there's a few things that we tested. So we conducted these interviews over the phone, which is, again, not super common for this type of evaluation, and we conducted shorter interviews. So we tried to keep it as lean as possible and really targeted specific outcomes. We also tried to get contacts for both groups, the treatment and comparison group, from the company that we were working with, which is a bit atypical, and we tried to get information at baseline. The problem that we encountered in this process is that companies don't often have phone numbers for farmers that they haven't started working with. And so in order for us to capture a proper baseline, we had to ask for newly registered farmers, and then when we interviewed those farmers, we asked them to reflect on the period just before they started engaging with the service. So that was kind of essentially how we worked around it. We haven't actually tested this yet, so we're going to have a follow-up round. But to do a diff and diff, you also need kind of 2 rounds of data collection. So you need the pre- and post-engagement with a company. So we conducted the first kind of pre-engagement baseline with 2 companies this year, and we're going to be doing a different round at the same time next year after the intervention has been administered, and so hopefully we'll have more insights for you then. But because we realized that it was difficult for us to get a baseline from the companies that we were working with, we also decided to expand our scope to a cross-sectional methodology where we didn't need a baseline. How many people are familiar with a cross-sectional approach? It's a little bit easier. Okay, great. Okay, so a cross-sectional evaluation approach only measures 1 period of time post-intervention, but you still have both a treatment and a comparison group. What this means is, although the results are robust and demonstrate the indication of correlation, the insights are not causal, but they're important and helpful nonetheless. So we did manage to finish 1 round of a cross-sectional approach with Tomorrow Now and KALRO this year. If you're not familiar with both organizations, Tomorrow Now and KALRO have partnered together to provide farmers in Kenya with hyperlocal SMS advisory services. So what this means is that they send farmers SMS messages that will tell them how much fertilizer they should be using, when to plant, how to build channels for drainage, things like that. So the first round of data collection was really focused on the post-planting period of the most recent long-grain season in Kenya. And so the indicators that we were looking at were very much focused in post-planting, but the follow-up round is going to look at more outcomes and post-harvest behaviors. So the way that we were able to do this evaluation is that we realized that with Tomorrow Now and KALRO, farmers were receiving 2 different types of messages. So maize farmers in Kenya could either be getting the hyperlocal messages that you get from Tomorrow Now, or they were getting the more generalized advisory that KALRO offers. And so what we set out to do was understand if there was a difference in outcomes between these 2 groups and the type of advisory that they were receiving. And then also if we saw that the farmers were actually adopting the advisory, the hyperlocal advisory that Tomorrow Now offered. And so you can see the first bullet is kind of the main behavior changes that we measured. So these are all things that Tomorrow Now advises on in their SMS advisory. And then the bottom 3, we were interested in looking at if those adopting those behaviors then translated to less pest infestations, more successful germination, and less crop loss. So this is an example of some of the insights that we got from this evaluation. So we saw that farmers receiving Tomorrow Now's advisory showed a higher awareness of soil cover techniques, which are advised by Tomorrow Now, and that they achieved a better seed germination in comparison to the comparison group. I did not include the regression table in this slide because I know that not very many people like to look at a regression table. But what we did do is that we actually took these differences and we controlled for various factors like age, gender, county, different things like that, and we saw that the relationship still held. So there was a clear relationship between receiving Tomorrow Now advisory and adopting these behaviors and achieving better outcomes. So again, what is the benefit of conducting a lean evaluation? So one of the key benefits of conducting the difference in difference, which is the first evaluation method that I spoke about, is that you can measure causal impact. And I'm looking forward, again, to sharing those results with you next year. But for now, what we've learned about the benefit of conducting the cross-sectional methodology is that it can help you establish an objective measure of how your intervention has impacted farmers. That is, it shows you how well the treatment group that received an intervention did relative to the comparison group. I also spoke to the Colro and Tomorrow Now team to understand, these insights were just delivered to them recently, so it's still fresh how they're using them, but I spoke to the team to understand how they plan to use them and how they have used them so far, and learned that this approach has really helped, particularly Colro, define their strategy for further digitization, which is something that they've been moving towards over the last few years, and so it showed evidence of how that can actually have a positive impact. It also improved gaps in services, so they were able to understand from feedback from farmers that the messaging was sometimes too confusing for them to understand, or it should have been translated to a different language, a local language, and so they were able to kind of implement those changes in their model. And it's also helping Tomorrow Now kind of secure more funding to expand their reach and reach more farmers across Kenya, which is great. So, choosing between the two. Okay, so I've talked to you about both methodologies, the Lean QIP and the Lean Evaluation. Really, when you're deciding around what kind of impact your organization or your partner organization might want to, I'm missing a K, is that what you just noticed? It's not $25, there should be a K at the end of that, sorry. But yeah, the difference between the two. So you really want to think about what your research question is, like what you're trying to answer. So for a QIP, you're wanting to answer, how are you having impact? So the goal is to validate an impact pathway. With an evaluation, you're wanting to answer, how much impact are you having? So the goal is to quantify causal or not causal impact. QIP, like I mentioned, is easier to implement. You can do it with a missed baseline. You don't need a comparison group. You can have a smaller sample size, and you only require one round of data collection. With the Lean evaluation, obviously, you'll need a baseline most of the time. You need a treatment and comparison group. You need a bigger sample size of roughly 1,000 farmers, and you need multiple rounds of collection. So it's a little bit harder to implement, but I've put it as a medium because it's not quite RCT level. So the cost, I put the cost up there just because I know that sometimes impact can seem quite daunting because it's expensive. These costs are also just reflective of kind of the piloting that we've been doing. So over time, as we start to improve these methodologies, that cost is going to go down. And it also ranges because it depends on how big your sample is. So for our samples, we had much bigger samples than was required for a QIP. How many questions you want to ask about, how many objectives. Outcomes, sorry. And so typically for QIP, it's between 25 and 50K, not 25 and $50. And for the Lean evaluation, it's between 60 and 80K per round. I know that was a lot, so if you have any questions.
Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. I'm with IDH, and we're actually collecting a lot of farm-level data ourselves, and we're really always looking for a leaner way to do this, because we so far have been doing this in person, and it's taking a lot of time with farmers. And we're really, inspired by your presentation on these lean evaluation methods. It was really insightful to hear how the data collection is much simpler, right, for the farmers, for organizations. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more towards how simple the analysis part is, because it's one thing to get the data, but once the data is in, how does it work? I heard you mentioning with the example of coding. Can you share a little bit more as to what happens after? Is it also as simple? And is it something that you as an organization would provide for others, or is it something that organizations can do themselves? What skills would you need to have in place? So basically asking about the leanness of the phase happening after the data collection is in. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Amazing. Okay, great question. So actually, if I were to talk to both methods, I would say the QIP is a little bit more time-consuming. I wouldn't say it was complex to analyze. So what you do is you get each individual response to the questions that you've asked. And so these are big kind of chunky paragraphs that the enumerator records from the farmers. And then your research team will read through and highlight what the cause was. So what they said was the reason why they had a behavior change, what the behavior change was, and then what the outcome was. So the example that I gave, the cause is I got DigiCow advisory, the behavior changes, I introduced mineral salts, and then the outcome is that I had better earnings and production. And so that process, it takes a little bit of time depending on how big your sample is, but I wouldn't say it's complex or difficult to do. We did this all using Excel, but there are other sources that you can use. So the University of Bath has like a tool that's meant to simplify how you conduct this. I think it's maybe a bit of a steep learning curve once you get onto it, but it does make it a little bit faster. And so as an organization like 60 Decibels, we've done a few of these now, super comfortable doing them, really enjoy doing them. But I wouldn't say that the actual analysis piece is super difficult to conduct, especially when you're looking at smaller samples. And then for the lean evaluation, again, we did it in Stata. So as long as you have some kind of expertise in using those solutions, it's really kind of easy to take that data and analyze. I don't know if you have anything to add there. Oh, yes. Okay, so the QUIP, the University of Bath actually has a lot of resources online where you can learn how to do this stuff, and they also offer consultation. So as an organization, you can definitely do it yourself. So we did, a few of us got trained with the kind of training that they offered. We also had access to all of the online resources, and then as we've been conducting them, we've been in consultation with the University of Bath to kind of help us make key decisions as we're doing the analysis. So the short answer is absolutely yes, you can do it yourselves. There's a little bit of kind of a learning curve as you learn how the system works, but it's something that everyone can do, and the same for the lean evaluation.
I will briefly introduce myself and 60 Decibels, and then I'll get to the topic of today. My name is Venu Agarwal. I lead the agriculture practice for an impact measurement company called 60 Decibels. What we do is, or actually, where to begin, is 60 decibels is the volume of human conversation. As a company, we help social enterprises and their funders understand their impact by listening directly to the end beneficiaries or customers that they intend to serve. We do this through short phone conversations to collect the data in local languages by in-country enumerators, and then the data is presented back as analyzed insights to companies within 12 weeks, so it can be used for better decision-making. We've done this many times over hundreds of thousands of respondents. If you want to talk to us, come find us. But let me get to the topic of today. Today, I'd like to talk to you about the digital agriculture market in Kenya. I don't think I need to prove to this room the significance of this market, but perhaps just one or two statistics from the latest Ag Funder report to give you a sense of the scale. Kenya has topped the list of African countries in terms of investment flow in the digital agriculture space in the last decade, as well as in 2022. For this market, we decided to partner with Busara and the Gates Foundation to try and understand the farmer's perspective, their experience with using digital agriculture to complement the supply side of the story that you hear many times over. This work is actually a part of a larger project that we are doing with the Gates Foundation and Busara to come up with a replicable methodology for measuring access and use of digital agricultural solutions in a given population. In Kenya specifically, we will be collecting data from over 2,500 farmers from 39 of the 47 counties over the long rain season that is currently started. So we've done the first round of data collection after farmers finished planting their crop. The second round is just about to get started and will focus on their harvesting experience. And the third round will happen early next year and focus on their selling experience. It's a little early to give you the full detailed insights, but I couldn't resist myself, so I'll give you a few teasers. In the post-planting round, so when we asked farmers to reflect on how they used and accessed information and advisory related to agriculture during long rains in the planting phase, 18% said that they had used a digital information service provider. Of this group, about 60%, so 3 in 5 farmers who had worked with a digital information provider said that they had used their mobile phone directly to access this information, and the rest of the 2 in 5 said that they had worked with an agent, either exclusively or in addition to using their own mobile phone. When the farmers talked about using their own mobile phone, we tried to ask how they had used their mobile phone to access this information, and SMS, as well as phone conversations, came up as the dominant channels for delivery of this information. By and large, we are seeing that farmers believe that their convenience of accessing information is higher, given that they're able to use digital tools, as is the amount of trust that they report in this information. But it's quite interesting to see that if you ask farmers about the timeliness with which they are receiving this information, only a fifth of them say that they are receiving information exactly when they need it. The rest of them say it comes a little too early. The majority say it comes a little too late for them to act on it. An even lesser percentage talks about how the majority of their needs, information needs, are met through digital means, which is, to say another way, digital tools are not really meeting all of farmers' information needs, which isn't surprising. I don't think anyone in this room is making an argument for sufficiency of digital means as being the ones to deliver all of the information that farmers look for during the season, but it's just, it's beginning to come up in the data that we are collecting. Another thing that we are seeing is that person-to-person interactions actually matter a fair bit. So farmers who do have an agent working with them, alongside them accessing information using a digital means, tend to be more satisfied, tend to feel like they can apply the information that they're getting more easily. So a lot more to come, but I at least wanted to tease the kinds of insights that you can expect and then leave you with a little bit of a timeline and what's coming next. So as I said, we are doing this research as a pilot of the methodology that we are developing with Busara and the Gates Foundation to develop population-level estimates. We have completed 1 round of data collection in July and August. We started the second round, we're actually starting the second round tomorrow. And this round will focus on farmers' experience of harvesting what they have planted during long rains. And then the third round will be in March, April. By the end of Q2, we will be ready with a public dashboard that will have all of the data that we have collected, and you will be able to filter it per your choice based on gender of the respondent, type of farming, and a whole bunch of other variables. If some of you may have seen our past work on COVID-19 and our research with Kenyan farmers, it'll be similarly interactive. We will also make the anonymized data sets, the survey instruments, as well as the methodology, and any research briefs or reports we produce available on this microsite, with the hope that, of course, whatever we learned is possibly only a beginning. You may use the data to come up with other ways of doing this, may want to repeat it, and so on and so forth. So that's upcoming, and what I've said so far is mainly a bit of a teaser. Where I would love to work with you guys is, we obviously cannot do this ourselves. We are coming up with a methodology to measure something that hasn't really been measured before. People tend to rely on active use, registered users, and so to figure out how to get a farmer to reflect on whether or not they have used a digital service and do that accurately is not easy. As a part of this effort, we are looking for up to 24 digital farmer service providers to partner with us. We will work with each of you to do a fully funded farmer insights research, which will of course involve questions of the kind that you have seen here. In the process, we hope that we can refine our methodology to make it more predictive. But as a participant, you will receive information from almost 300 of your farmers who will be surveyed by 60 decibels enumerators. You'll get a report, the anonymized data set, and you become a partner in this effort. In terms of qualification, we are looking for organizations who are providing agricultural products or services to farmers digitally. What that means is, and there's a slight caveat to it, we are only focusing on farmers' own mobile phones as the first delivery channel, and the second delivery channel is a digitized agent. We couldn't do the full gamut of digitization and innovations that all of you work on, at least in the first phase. But if you're an organization that uses either of those methods, you can scan this QR code, you can find my colleague Irene, Hanadi, Ayushi, or me, and talk to us. We have to focus on 4 geographies, at least to begin with. So these 24 companies, our first hypotheses are likely to come from Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and India. If there's opportunity to expand, we absolutely will, but right now we might have to limit ourselves. And then, because 60 decibels collects data using phone conversations, we need you to have at least 750 phone numbers of your customers, farmers, who are using the digital means. So that's sort of where I would like to work with you to grow this initiative. If you have any questions, I can take them now or direct them to the right person. Alternatively, you can reach out to us on this email address, scan the QR code.
We have a very specific way of defining impact. I'm in the economics world, so I want to share that vocabulary with you. To define impact in the sense of the word from the economics perspective, we need something called the counterfactual. And the counterfactual represents the world that participants would have experienced without your program in it. So I will explain this with this graph. We can take any program, perhaps a digital climate advisory, or you can substitute your program here. So a digital climate advisory starts. It's implemented out to a group of farmers, and we're interested in some outcome. You can fill in your own outcome here, but perhaps you're interested in yields. So we can see the yellow line. This is how your farmers are doing in terms of yields. After your program starts, their yields are positive, so they're increasing. So we might want to declare that your program has had an impact on farmers' yields. However, I would charge you to say, well, how do we know that this wasn't due to other external factors? What if the government had implemented a program around the same time? What if something happened to the market prices that season? We just went through a global pandemic, and agricultural markets were very different. There could be many macroeconomic conditions that impact, what is happening to your constituents on the ground. So in an ideal scenario, we would want to know the counterfactual. That's what would have happened to farmers over that time period if you had never implemented the program with them. They would have experienced those same macroeconomic factors, and from there we would want to compare what happened with the counterfactual and what happened in the real world, and that's how we get to impact. So of course, we can't directly observe the counterfactual. We don't have a time machine. We can't go back in time and take away your product or service from your stakeholders. So in impact evaluation, what we have to do is try to construct it artificially. There's a lot of different ways to do it. You've probably heard the words quasi-experimental and experimental. Today I'm going to be talking about estimating a counterfactual through randomization. Okay, so what I want to communicate today is that randomized evaluations are a really rigorous way to shed light on causal impacts. So I'm going to take the same example that we were talking about, the digital climate advisory and its impact on yield. So here we have the population that we want to serve with your digital advisory product. So the population is varied. I'm going to say here that the farmers that are in dark orange have more resources. You can take that however you like it. Maybe their soil is more nutrient dense. Maybe they have better access to household assets. You get it. They're more resourced households. The light orange farmers here have less resources. So we want to understand here if the digital climate advisory had an impact on yields or if there's other factors that are at play. So like I said earlier, we would want to construct a counterfactual. In an ideal world, we'd give the program to a group of farmers, wait some time, measure their yield, and then go back in time, actually not give them the product, and measure their yields without the program. But we can't do that. So what we're going to do is achieve a similar goal by randomly assigning individuals to receive the program or not. Okay, so now you can see our population is randomly assigned. And since this was a random assignment, just like flipping a coin or drawing their name out of a hat, we can be confident that they do not differ systematically at the beginning of the study. This is a bit tricky. You do have to have enough sample size to ensure that statistically this actually works out. So, for example, before the program starts, the group that receives the program is not systematically better or worse off than the group that does not. So after randomization, we'll begin the program. Okay, and we can see now that the only systemic difference between the two groups is the presence of the program. We've removed individual characteristics from the equation, and they're both experiencing the same macroeconomic factors. If the markets change, both groups are experiencing that effect. So this is what we can conclude. Randomization allows a causal interpretation of the difference between the treatment and control group. Okay. All right, so we've built a shared vocabulary. We've talked about impact, the power of randomization. Now, these are some considerations that you might want to think about if you're exploring a randomized evaluation. The first one is very important. What is your question of interest? So I really encourage you as you're building out your MEL plan to get really clear on your question of interest. RCTs, as Hannah said earlier, are one tool in our toolbox. There are many great MEL questions that are not about impact evaluation. So what is my customer success story? Or how can I improve my product design so users are not dropping off? Those are not questions that are well equipped for an impact evaluation, but they're great questions to ask. So it's really important to get clear on what you want from your MEL and build it in early. Because if the findings aren't actionable and they won't improve your program learning, then why spend the time or resources using the wrong tool? Okay, the next thing that's really important to consider is there an element that can be randomized? Certain environments are not conducive to RCTs. One scenario I think of is a humanitarian setting where the service delivery might be iterating daily. And in RCT, or a randomized evaluation, the idea is that you hold the product or service steady until you can evaluate it carefully in the control and intervention group. So if you're uncomfortable tinkering with your product, maybe you're more early stage, then a randomized evaluation, it just might not be the right time for you. Which leads me to the next consideration. Is the timing right? This is why it's really important to build impact into your MEL strategy. If you're wrestling with your theory of change, then a randomized evaluation might happen later for you. An RCT is really valuable to make the case to funders and impacted investors, especially when a lot of resources are being invested in your program and there's not a lot of evidence to cover it. And then finally, adequate resources. I'm going to talk about this later. Because I work for a university, I have a really wide network of researchers, and one thing that we do is match make organizations with researchers that have the expertise to conduct a randomized evaluation. But do know that your organization is going to have to dedicate time to the effort. Often that means providing data to the researcher. And then finally, not to forget, research ethics is, of course, a cross-cutting theme. I wanted to mention, because some people are uncomfortable with the idea of a control group, they don't want to not provide their product or service to a group of farmers. There are ways where you can circumvent this. There's something called a phase-in design, where you can stage your randomized evaluation over several years. So year one, a group will receive the intervention, and the group that served as the control group in year one will then receive the intervention in year two. So there are ways to think about rolling out your intervention in stages so that eventually everyone in your target population receives the intervention. Okay, so this is my plug. This is a really wonderful course evaluating social programs. Right now, it's freely accessible online. I think it's freely accessible for another month. It's run through JPAL and MITx. We did a really brief overview of randomized evaluation. This course is going to go really in depth. It'll talk about research ethics, talk about theory of change and how you can build one for your organization, common threats and pitfalls to the validity of experiments, and techniques to incorporate experiments into your product or service. So did I mention it's freely accessible online? I highly recommend checking this out. They also have in-person offerings too. Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten the randomized evaluation training out of the way, let's talk about a real-world example. Okay, so this example is Saudi East Africa. This is a tech company whose mission is to empower women-led enterprises. It's based here in Kenya. This evaluation was done through the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the challenge that Saudi East Africa is trying to solve is small-scale agricultural informal traders, who are mostly women, don't have a lot of power when it comes to boarding crossings. They face long queues and often bribery and corruption. Saudi East Africa sought to find out what would happen if they empowered these women with more information. So they provided them information about currency exchange rates, market prices, where to buy, where to sell, weather forecast, and legal tax requirements at border crossings for these traders. And working with a researcher whose name is Eleanor Wiseman, based at UC Berkeley, they asked the question, can Saudi East Africa, by providing this market information digitally, encourage women traders to select more cost-effective and profitable trade routes and reduce their vulnerability to bribery and corruption? Okay, so this was the study design. So kind of going back to before, you can see how they randomized. They had over 1,000 informal traders who were assigned to one of two groups. And the group that received the intervention actually had an in-person component, kind of like an in-person bridge, where the women received training on how to use Saudi East Africa. And there's no data in the paper, but I know we've been talking about hybrid models today, and I think this in-person training might have really helped to increase uptake of Saudi East Africa among this population. And then in the comparison group, it was status quo. Those traders did not receive access to the training or the mobile platform. So by using this design, we can really confidently speak to these results, which are really amazing. The women that used Saudi East Africa compared to those who didn't saw a 17 to 18 increase in their profits. And this was likely because the Saudi East Africa app was giving them information on where they could buy goods at a lower price, and so that reduced their cost. And it gave them information on where they could sell at a good price, and so that increased their revenue, which is really spectacular. There was an increase in cross-border trading, and also we saw that consumers received reduced prices. So some of the profits that the informal traders were seeing were actually passed through to customers. Okay, so at SIGA and JPAL, one thing that we really focus on is aggregating and synthesizing evidence. So this case study is part of a policy insight that goes through 41 randomized evaluations on improving agricultural information services to increase productivity, both for farmers and for traders, as we saw in the previous example. Perhaps I want to cue this up for the end, but one thing that we offer as an initiative are evidence seminars. So if you're looking for specific evidence on your program model or the digital app that you work on or are pursuing, we have a lot of different evidence syntheses and can provide that to you. Okay, so we've talked about randomized evaluation methodology. We've talked about one case study. So now I'm going to talk about a funding mechanism for digital and bundled tools. And this is the last section of the presentation, so we can have some Q&A after chapter 3. Okay, so here at the AgriFin Learning Event, I'm surrounded by incredible technologists. It's quite humbling to be here. I don't think I need to dwell on the transformative power of digital technologies because you all are working on those, and it's quite amazing hearing about all of the different approaches and tools today. As the digital ecosystem grows, it's crucial to understand what works and why. And that is to improve welfare for small-scale producers, connect farmers to markets, and expand commercialization. Right now, we see that there's a really big evidence gap on bundled approaches, and that's multiple services that come together to meet farmers' needs. So there's a really big lack of randomized evaluations on this topic area. So DAISY is the initiative that I co-manage, the Digital Agricultural Innovations and Services Initiative. We're seeking to create a rigorous evidence base, mostly using experimental studies, to carefully identify how and whether digital tools and bundled approaches improve outcomes for small-scale producers. So what guides our funding decision? Well, we have 6 priority research themes, which are outlined in our framing paper. And we also focus on women and youth as small-scale producers and resource use and climate resilience. In fact, at least one of the providers that we're evaluating spoke at the conference earlier today. So how do we fund research? We use competitive peer-reviewed funding rounds. We have over a decade of experience with these competitive peer-reviewed funding rounds in our Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative, with the idea that the best athlete proposal wins the award funding. And we mostly fund randomized evaluations, but we also fund projects that are on the pathway to a randomized evaluation. So pilots, proposal development, and new categories are A/B testing, which is an experimental design that looks at more short-run outcomes, as well as scaling grants. Okay, so just a couple quick definitions. These are in our framing paper and important if you do want to apply to DAISY. I won't spend long on digital, but just want to mention that we mean it in the broadest sense of the word. Oftentimes, artificial intelligence, drones, or remote sensors don't come to mind with digital, but we use digital very broadly. And then perhaps more important is our definition of bundled. We have a very specific way that we define this, so it will become important if you want to matchmake with a researcher and apply for funding. We define bundled as a service that simultaneously relaxes 2 or more constraints faced by a farmer or some other actor in the agricultural value chain. And you can read on the slide, I have some common constraints that are listed here. But we want proposals to address at least 2 of them because, as I mentioned earlier, this is really where the evidence gap lies. There's a pretty good number of randomized evaluations on tools that address 1 constraint that a farmer might face, but not a lot that are addressing 2 or more. Okay, so I'm just going to give quick examples of 2 projects that are in the field right now, and both of these examples are pilots. So they're not yet employing randomization, but the researchers are working with the implementing partner to plan for a full study. So in Uganda, researchers are working with a company that digitizes transactions, and through this digitization, they're able to construct credit algorithms and provide better access to credit for small-scale milk producers. And the idea is that these milk producers are in a relationship with their transporters and intermediaries that bring their milk to the cooperatives and often don't have a lot of bargaining power and don't receive a fair price for their milk. And so this fintech company is aiming to shift that power dynamic between transporters and small-scale milk producers. And hopefully the randomized evaluation will tell us some answers about the question that's listed here. Okay, and then this is the second of 2 projects I wanted to mention. This is also a pilot. In Ghana, researchers are working with a tech company that serves last-mile livestock producers by providing digital livestock advisory and then also pharmaceutical services. And they want to know if that bundle of products can improve livestock health and household income and welfare. Okay, so how can we work together? As I mentioned earlier, we have over 1,000 researchers in our network, and one big activity that we undertake is what we call matchmaking. It's not like dating, but we will match service providers who are interested in a randomized evaluation with an expert in impact evaluation. So if you're interested in this, let me know. We have a process that you can go through. We have a matchmaking form where you'll fill out some information about your product, what you want evaluated, and then we can move forward with the process and find someone who might want to work with you. As I mentioned earlier, we also share existing evidence. We have evidence on risk, agricultural information delivery, quality certification. So if you're interested in an evidence seminar, we'd be happy to do that, or I can share the evidence that we have with you. And then finally, building capacity. So earlier I mentioned JPAL's course in randomized evaluation. That's their bread and butter. They have a really amazing training arm in their organization to create more capacity and impact evaluation methods. At SIGA, we work more in research reproducibility and transparency. So if there's any researchers in the audience, we try to build capacity in improving science, particularly social science research itself. So I'd love to talk a bit more about that to you if you're interested.
We're leveraging the challenges identified in these studies and looking at them from the perspective of farmer behavior. We're less focused on policies and products and more focused on why a farmer is using a given product. Our work entails understanding the context that they operate within, identifying the norms, beliefs, and behaviors that drive their decisions. Relatedly, since we're studying norms, analyzing the adoption of digital services among smallholder farmers using a behavioral science lens allows us to look at gender norms more critically and explicitly. We know from past studies that gender norms influence the adoption of digital services among women farmers. If we don't consider these barriers whenever we're in these different factors, whenever we're designing and implementing solutions, we may inadvertently create barriers for women in adopting digital services. I'll provide a more concrete example later in the presentation. So when I speak of digital services, I mean that quite broadly. Under the digital grant, we're partnering with 6 different digital service providers, and at a high level, they can be grouped into 4 different categories. Some of our partners offer digital services for extension agents, providing them with information digitally on things like planting and harvesting. Some of our partners also offer digital data collection platforms for extension workers, so they can collect data digitally on the farmers in their communities and offer them more customized advice. Some of our partners provide digital services directly to smallholder farmers, giving them information on things like markets and prices through mediums like SMS, IVR, and WhatsApp. One of our partners offers a digital platform for smallholder farmers to share information with each other. Our partners for this research had operations across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and they all had questions on how to increase the adoption of their digital services. So our approach to increasing adoption under the digital grant has been to nudge smallholder farmers to take up and use the different products and services offered by our partners. A nudge is a relatively small, relatively inexpensive intervention aimed at overcoming key barriers. Our nudges pave the way for farmers to adopt digital services, removing, or in some cases leveraging, any noise that can pose a barrier. Nudges are a relatively common approach to increasing adoption in the agricultural sector. I have 3 examples listed on this slide. In the first example I have listed here, researchers in Ethiopia found that farmers were not aware of certain new farming technologies. They wanted to explore low-cost ways to encourage farmers to share information with each other, effectively removing any barriers posed by lack of awareness. So they decided to offer leaders of farming groups certificates to encourage them to share information with their peers. In the second example I have listed here, researchers found that farmers in Mali would become really busy during certain seasons and forget to use extension advice that they learned during training. In response, they decided to send SMS reminders to smallholder farmers during certain times of the year, reminding them to use what they had learned. Finally, the last study I have listed here is a very famous one, where researchers offered smallholder farmers in Kenya vouchers to purchase fertilizer immediately after harvest when they had cash on hand, as opposed to waiting until later in the year when cash was tight. This led to more farmers purchasing and using fertilizer. So how do you design an effective nudge? How do you ensure that the nudge you implement leads to adoption? We found that the most effective nudges are grounded in the context of end users. End users are whoever is using your product or service. In the case of our research, the end users are smallholder farmers and extension workers most typically. Understanding their context requires you to gather information on their experiences and realities. Remember, we want to make sure that the nudges overcome a key barrier. In the example that I gave on the previous slide, the SMS messages overcame the barriers of farmers becoming too busy and forgetting to use extension advice. We also want to make sure that the nudges we design are grounded within the context and are congruent with the environments that smallholder farmers are operating within. So we found that the best way to gather this information is to use methods from human-centered design. At a high level, human-centered design is an approach that puts end users at the heart of the design process. It's focused on having the end user tell the researcher about their experiences and what they want and need, not the other way around. I'll acknowledge that there are many ways to do this. For the purposes of today's presentation, I'll explain the approach that we're following under the digital grant. For each of our 6 partners, we're beginning our research by talking to their target market. We're conducting in-depth interviews and focus group discussions to understand the barriers they face to adoption, asking open-ended questions and probing deep to understand the underlying challenges. We're intentionally including women in our discussions and interviews, making sure that we're able to uncover different barriers by gender. Then, once we've identified the barriers, we're conducting co-design workshops with farmers and key stakeholders to co-design solutions that overcome these different barriers. In the co-design workshops, we are taking farmers and the stakeholders that are participating in the workshops through a series of brainstorming exercises. So 2 examples of those are asking how might we questions and story completion exercises. We're presenting the challenges that are faced by women that we've uncovered through our research and acknowledging their experiences in our brainstorming. So at the end of the co-design workshops, we have a list of feasible human-centered interventions that we then develop into prototypes. So in summary, nudges can lead to adoption by removing key barriers. In the case of our research that I'm talking about today, we're focused specifically on the adoption of digital services. Effective nudges are grounded in the context and realities of the end user, and methods from human-centered design can help you gather this information. In-depth interviews and focus group discussions can give you the opportunity to understand the context, realities, and experiences of farmers, giving you the opportunity to dig deep to understand the underlying barriers to adoption. Co-design workshops give you the opportunity to design around these barriers and brainstorm ideas in partnership with the end user. It gives them the opportunity to tell you what they want and need. So for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to provide 2 examples from our work under the Digital Grant. In the first example, we were exploring ways to nudge smallholder farmers and extension workers to use a digital data collection platform. So we partnered with the Goat Trust in India. The Goat Trust offers a variety of different services for women extension workers in India, and provides them with different platforms for them to better serve the goat farmers in their community and help connect them to markets. In the current method, in the current system, the women extension workers collect data on the farmers in their community using a paper and clipboard, which they then use to offer the farmers in their communities more customized advice, access to inputs, and help them get fair prices for their goats. To streamline this process, the Goat Trust gave these women smartphones and asked that they begin collecting data digitally. They're currently in the process of developing an app, but in the meantime, they asked that the women collect this data on their smartphones and send it to them on WhatsApp. However, we found that the women were reluctant to give up their paper and clipboard. Through in-depth interviews and focus group discussions, we found 3 key reasons why. First, we found that the women had competing priorities on a number of different levels. The women were very busy with both their personal and professional responsibilities, and they would often forget to use their smartphones for digital data collection. They were also expected to share the smartphones with their families, and they often had to justify to their family members why they needed the smartphones for their work more than their other family members. Second, we found that the women didn't trust that their data was being saved on the smartphone. We also found that they weren't confident that their data was being sent via WhatsApp to the Goat Trust. They simply sent the data via WhatsApp and never heard anything in response. Finally, because the women weren't sure that the data was being saved and sent on their smartphones, they continued to collect data using a paper and clipboard, in addition to collecting the data digitally. We also found that the women had entire organizational systems set up for their paper-based data collection methods, and they could go back and easily reference information if they needed. What we found was that, in their opinion, paper-based data collection was necessary, and collecting the same data digitally was double effort. And so we conducted co-design workshops with some of these extension workers to try to brainstorm solutions to overcome the barriers we identified. We conducted a series of story completion exercises where we started to tell a story, gauged the women's responses, and asked how they would complete the story. So recall that the first barrier that we identified was that the women had competing priorities. In response, we co-designed a poster for them to take home with them after training that provided step-by-step instructions on how to complete digital data collection. This poster broke down digital data collection into easy and manageable steps that the women could easily reference whenever they were feeling busy and overwhelmed. The poster also serves as a reminder for her family that she needs the smartphone to do her job. We tested the potential impact of these posters using mini RCTs on a variety of different indicators, and we found that the posters were effective at making the women more comfortable using the smartphone for their jobs. Through the mini RCTs, we found that the women who had the posters were more likely to attend a virtual meeting with the Goat Trust. We also co-designed some confirmation messages that the women now receive whenever they send their data on WhatsApp. So now when the women send their data to the Goat Trust, they receive a confirmation message letting them know that their data was saved and received. When we conducted a feedback survey on their different nudge ideas, and we found that for this idea, over 75% of the women said that they understand that this message means that their data was saved and received. Finally, we co-designed certificates that the women could earn if they were using their smartphones for digital data collection. In these certificates, these women could hang them outside of their homes, and the certificates emphasize that the women use digital data collection methods to better serve the farmers in her community. The idea behind these certificates wasn't necessarily to shift the women away from paper-based data collection. We know from our in-depth interviews and focus group discussions that the paper-based data collection methods are really important for the women. Rather, these certificates are meant to provide a little extra incentive, making the double effort of both paper-based data collection and digital data collection worth her while. When we gathered feedback on the certificate, we found that the majority of women said that they would like the opportunity to receive the certificate. When we tested its potential impact using mini RCTs, we found that having the opportunity to earn the certificate made the women more likely to use their smartphones in the field for her job. So this next example, we looked at ways to optimize and redesign advisory. This example is slightly different from the last one in that we weren't necessarily looking for nudges to encourage the adoption of a digital service. Rather, we were looking for ways to optimize advisory and then explore the possibility of using different digital services to help farmers apply the advisory. We partnered with the Excellence in Agronomy on the Akalimo Toolkit for smallholder cassava farmers in Nigeria. Akalimo offers printed guides for lead farmers and extension workers with information on everything from planting to harvesting. In the current state, the guides that are being offered, Akalimo wanted them to be very customized and specific, acknowledging the science and precision behind most agricultural practices. But through our research, they wanted us to explore ways to optimize the guides, redesigning the information so that it's both easy to understand and apply, while also incorporating the details and technicalities of farming. So we conducted focus group discussions and in-depth interviews with lead farmers and extension workers, and we found two key opportunity areas. First, we found that the guides, which you see here on this slide, have a number of what we call hassle factors, which in behavioral science lingo are minor inconveniences that have disproportionately large impacts on behavior. The guides had a lot of words and took a long time to understand and took a long time to read. They also made the lead farmers and extension workers do math. Second, and most interesting in my opinion, we found that the guides in the current state didn't incorporate or acknowledge traditional farming practices. Through our in-depth interviews and focus group discussions with the lead farmers and extension workers, we found that they held on deeply to the traditional farming practices that were passed on to them by their forefathers. Because the guides took a long time to understand, when the lead farmers and extension workers couldn't necessarily make sense of them, they defaulted to their traditional practices and gave advice that was passed on to them by their forefathers and continued practicing farming as they had for generations. And so we conducted co-design workshops with lead farmers, extension workers, Akalimo, the Excellence in Agronomy, and 8 of their partners. In these workshops, we gave the lead farmers and extension workers the guides and asked them to circle areas that they found unclear or difficult to understand, which is what you see in this photo here. We also posed a series of how might we questions to facilitate brainstorming. For example, we asked the farmers, how might we incorporate traditional customs and values into the guides while also making them more simplified and easy to understand. And so we co-designed a series of guides that are with significantly less text than the originals, where we replaced much of the words with images. We were careful to make sure that the guides we designed conveyed the same key concepts as the original guides. The idea behind these guides is that the lead farmers and extension workers can look at them quickly and understand what to do next. We're currently in the process of testing these guides. We've designed a couple different versions of them, and we're testing to see which ones convey the key concepts that they need to, while also increasing the adoption of advisory services. We also co-designed a series of messages that acknowledge traditional farming practices. We're currently testing these messages, and we're not testing the messages using any specific medium. We're just testing them very generally. But if they're proven effective, our partners can explore incorporating these messages into some of the WhatsApps and IVRs and SMS messages that they send to help farmers apply the advisory services that are being given to them. So in the messages, we say that Akalimo acknowledges the importance of traditional practices and explain why at times it's necessary to shift away from these practices. In the message that we have here on the screen, we say that weather patterns are changing, and so farming patterns should change too. The idea behind these messages is that they can serve as a reminder for lead farmers and extension workers to help them prevent falling back onto their traditional practices and adopt the new methods in the guides. We're currently in the process of testing the effect of these messages using an RCT to make sure that they achieve its desired result. And so that takes me to the end of my presentation. But before I end, I want to give a quick recap on everything that I've presented and tie everything back to the theme of today's presentation, generating evidence. So I hope that after this presentation today, you have a better understanding of nudges and how they can be used to increase adoption. Remember that nudges are meant to overcome key barriers, and they should be designed to be congruent with the environment that the end user is operating within. Examples include certificates for lead farmers to share information with each other. We hope that through the nudges that we design and implement through this grant, we can encourage the widespread adoption of digital services among smallholder farmers, fully realizing the potential of digital services and reinforcing smallholder farmers' climate resilience and improving their productivity and well-being. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation.